Paul Merton, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much indeed. I'm very well indeed.
It's nice to see you because you're always funny, and I like that about you.
Oh, that's good. That's put the pressure on for this interview then, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting. You're funny, but you don't like to laugh. Well, not very often, anyway.
I suppose, yes, when I'm doing a television thing, I do sort of, I do laugh a lot in normal life. But there is something to be said for sort of, if you keep a sort of straight face when you're saying something funny, you get an extra laugh because you look as if you don't get the joke yourself. So that just adds to the laughter, really. It's as cynical as that.
I'll tell you what's great about you. You seem to be so quick and quicker than everybody else. Nobody ever seems to get one over you, which is such a skill. How did you develop that?
I don't know. I suppose being at school, you know, I was sort of one of those kids who, when I was about 8 or 9, I knew every joke going in the Beano, you know. But then when I got into my teens, I started sort of like, I suppose what we call ad-libbing or improvise, and just making stuff up with people, and just I've been doing that all my life really. So it's sort of it's a honed skill, if it is a skill, and that's where it comes from. One
of the things I love to do is coming down and see one of your shows at the Comedy Store when you've just got those nights where anything can happen.
The Comedy Store Players, yeah, every Sunday and Wednesday. Yeah.
Why do you bother putting yourself through that? I mean, wouldn't it be easier just to get an act, do 10 minutes and clear off instead of having the danger of being booed off if you're not funny?
Oh, well, you've always got the danger of being booed off just doing the stand-up, you know. But the reason why I do the Comedy Store Players show every week is because it's a social thing. The 6 of us do the show. It's always completely different. I was a stand-up many years ago, but I did find it a little bit it is a little bit lonely. You know, and it can be, you know, and I wasn't one of those people that enjoyed listening to myself on stage for 2 hours. I mean, some people love it and it's written into their DNA, but I'm not one of them really. I prefer in sharing the gig with people and then sort of sharing the after gig stuff with people as well. So with stand-up, it's not always that easy.
I always think it's interesting. I talk to a lot of comedians because I'm so passionate about comedy. I'm more of a gag man myself. I like a punchline. And we'll talk about that in a minute regarding the new book of silent comedy. When you put yourself in that arena, something like Jongleurs or the Comedy Store, you've got to be insane to want to do that because they can turn on you, and they do. And that presumably is the worst feeling in the world.
Yes, it is. It's pretty bad because you know you've set yourself up as somebody who's trying to be funny and the audience aren't enjoying it. I hopefully now I don't often play to many drunks. That's the problem, you see. We go to a late night club, Saturday night, Friday night sort of thing, midnight show or whatever. Then people are going to be a little bit the worse for wear, and trying to sort of deal with a drunk heckler is not easy because they're so drunk they don't even understand that you're putting them down. You know, so
it can be funny to a point, but it can also be distracting for the audience. And I've also seen that happen where the audience turn on the audience, and that's even worse than them turning on the comic.
Yes, exactly. yes, exactly. I did a gig about 20 years ago at a club in Brixton, and there was 2 guys in the front that were sort of just heckling every act, and every act had a really hard time. So what I did was I took the audience out of the pub, out into the car park where there was a light, and there was about sort of 40 people who gathered around me, and I did my act out there. So they couldn't get rid of the heckler, so I moved the venue.
I suppose that's one way out of it, isn't it?
Exactly.
We're going to talk about your life and career. We're going to talk about the new book on silent comedy as well, and the TV series that went with it. I'm so fascinated by you because you're a very private man, and I don't blame you. You let your work speak for itself.
Yes.
Are you happy on the other side of the desk, or would you rather be sat in a TV studio where you're just being funny?
No, I'm not sure I understand the question, really. What are you asking?
Well, a lot of comedians don't like being funny when you ask them to ad-lib.
Oh, right,
or
yes.
a lot of comedians don't like talking about themselves because they're a character. I remember my disappointment the first time I interviewed Julian Clary. He seemed so sad and so unfunny. The second time I interviewed him, he was slightly better, but there's something kind of tragic about comedians. You seem to be laughing at that. That's a relief.
I don't know. There is a sort of, it's a bit of a myth that, I mean, Julian just might have been having a headache or something, might have been having a bad day. But I think it's a bit of a myth that comedians are necessarily depressive sort of people. You get certain types of people who are, you know, who would be depressive plumbers if they were plumbers. It seems that it's an interesting sort of idea because the notion that the funny person is actually crying inside appeals to our sort of sense of opposites. But most comedians I know are actually sort of no more bonkers than anybody else.
I think it's harder for the newer comedians to do interviews like this. If you interview somebody like Ken Don, he can go, ha 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 ha, and suddenly he's into the act, and it's the act, and you get that for the interview. I mean, you are you, really. I don't see you as an act because
that's good.
You come across as a real person, which is different, isn't it, from the old style?
I suppose so, yes. I mean, you had to be a sort of like, you know, Ken Dodd, wonderful comic, larger than life, and when he started off in the 50s in the musical, you know, playing big sort of theatres that weren't very full of people, you had to be sort of quite large and and to get your comedy across, I think. I can still remember with great affection jokes that he did on the radio about sort of 40 years ago that made me laugh. You know, a man walks into a shop and somebody says to him, "You're a bit toffee-nosed, aren't you?" He says, "I can't help it. It's toffee on the end of my nose." I remember that when I was about 11 when I heard that. And so it's funny how sort of jokes, sometimes jokes just stick with you.
He was the first comedian I ever saw that made me want to be interested in comedy. I found him so curious, and I still to this day, whenever I meet him or go and see his show, I'm fascinated by his ability. He's really of that old school that he loves it and lives for it, which is tremendous.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he's you know, he's a working comic. He wants to keep on working, and you know, if you are a comedian, it does make sense to keep sort of working live. That's partly one of the reasons why I do the Comedy Store, just to keep sort of match fit for when you're doing television programs.
I want to talk about the newer comics now, like the Russell Brands, who are so popular right now. It seems to me, I don't know what you think about it, that their free-thinking form of comedy, where they just talk about what comes into their mind, it's not necessarily gags like Ken Dodd does. It seems to be of the time. I'm not sure whether it's going to be around in 25 years, let alone 50 years. What do you think about that?
Yes. Well, he seems to be sort of very, very on top of what he's doing, so I should think he probably would be around in 5 years' time. I don't know. I don't know how sort of. I mean, Russell's managed to do it in the last couple of years. How you go these days from being sort of like a fairly anonymous comic to being a well-known one, because there's just so many people doing it. Every year when I go to Edinburgh with the improv show that we do, you see a whole bunch of posters up on the wall in the venue, and they're completely new people I've never heard of. And last year there was a whole bunch of completely new people that I hadn't heard of then either, and before that. So there's hundreds of people doing it. So how you ever sort of get spotted or stand out from the crowd, I don't know how you do it. I suppose I have no idea, actually. I just don't know. I mean, when I started off doing I was very lucky when I started off doing stand-up comedy, because the only venue going was the Comedy Store. So when that closed down for 18 months, and that's when all these other places like Jongleurs and the King's Head and Crouch End opened up as comedy clubs to serve that audience was no longer pardon me, was no longer going to the Comedy Store. So when I started, I was able to phone up Jongleurs and say, well, I've done the Comedy Store, then I could phone up somewhere else and say I've played Jongleurs. So it was very easy to get bookings, and there weren't many comics around. Often I would be on a bill with maybe a poet, a juggler, a mime artist, a guitarist, and I'd be the only comic on the bill. I mean, those days only lasted about sort of 4 or 5 months, I think. But it was a very good time to be doing it. But now, I mean, you know, somebody was telling me the other day, you have to sort of, you know, some of the big venues, you go to do an open spot, and 6 months later, you come back and do another one, if you were any good 6 months beforehand. And so how you build a career doing that, I don't know.
It's also fascinating when you read people's autobiographies like Graham Norton, who admits that he doesn't write jokes, he's an actor, and he's given jokes. And Ricky Gervais, I think, is the same. He's not a stand-up comedian, he's never tried to be, although he's selling out arenas now being a stand-up.
Yes.
So is he acting being a stand-up then?
Well, I haven't seen his stuff, so I imagine so, yes. I mean, stand-up's one of those things, there's much more to it than appears obvious from the surface of it, you know. It's not just a question of standing up and saying jokes. I don't know, if people have spent a lot of money to go and see Ricky, I imagine they've invested a lot of, you know, they've invested the money and they've sort of invested some of their emotion into it. So they want it to be a good gig, so they want to have a good time. So, I don't know, you know, if they see him doing stand-up and they're happy with that, then the world is a happier place.
It does seem to me, Paul, that if you're well known, it is easier to get the laughs, providing you've got some decent material, than if you're unknown, because they're kind of in on your act and your style and who you are, therefore will laugh quicker.
Yes, yeah, I think that's true to a certain extent, because you know, when I used to go on the you know, do the stand-up, you try and make an impression very early on. You try to, you know, first 10 seconds would have the best joke I had. And that sort of settles the audience down and think, oh, okay, that was funny, so maybe this guy's going to be all right. Now, I suppose I wouldn't have to do that if I was to do stand-up, but you've still got to deliver, you've still got to have the gags, I suppose. But yeah, it's got to be a lot easier once people have come specifically to see you.
Presumably those first 10 seconds are very important if you're doing something like Jongleurs or the Comedy Store.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I used to go out, my first gag used to be during, I used to start off by saying I'm a topical comedian. During the Blitz in the Second World War, my dad used to say, don't worry about the bombs, the only bomb you've got to worry about is the one that's got your name written on it. That scared the next door neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Doodlebug. So that was my first joke. That usually went over quite well, because Doodlebug's such an unexpected word to hear in a punchline.
Silent comedy. You're going to have to really help me with this, Paul, because I love comedy, but I don't get silent comedy.
Yes. Well, I think you've probably only ever seen it on television, because it's as good as it can be on television. It's so much better in the live experience. I first saw a Buster Keaton film called The General when I was 13 years old, and it had a live accompaniment, a big screen, a big audience, and it's transformed. It is it's very difficult to describe unless you've seen it. And what we've done in Bristol the last 3 years at the Bristol Silence show that we do, the first year we had 600 people, the next year we had 1,000, and last year we had 1,500. So it's leapt. So once people come to see it once, they're converted. But it's sort of, if you see it on television, often you've sort of got a poor organ score, some terrible organ music, or the print's wrong, or it's shown at the wrong speed, or it's missing bits, or the print is too dark, and so many different things can go wrong. You know, Channel 4 used to show some Buster Keaton films, and some of the music was just appalling. I didn't bother watching them myself. It can make such a difference. I'm doing a tour, not tied to the book, but we're going on a tour where we're showing some silent films around the country. One of them is we're going to show the full feature-length Harold Lloyd film Safety Last, which is the one where he's climbing up the side of a building and ends up hanging on the end of a clock. Now, when you see that film with an audience, the last 25 minutes of the film is him starting his climb up the side of this building. And audiences get so involved in it. And when we showed it at Bristol a couple of years back, a woman in front of me suddenly leapt up halfway through this building climbing sequence and shouted out, stop it, I can't stand it. And the build-up of tension and the laughter is extraordinary. And it's an experience. It's not like a normal cinema experience. The difference between watching a silent film in its proper environment, a silent comedy's proper environment, and watching it on television is like the difference between hearing music on beautiful speakers or listening to it under 6 feet underwater. You know, it's a completely different thing. So you should come along and have a look.
Well, the clock sketch that you talk about did make me laugh. It's the Laurel and Hardy stuff I don't get. I've watched a few of your programmes on BBC Three, and it's been fascinating to see you describe your take on everything. Yeah. Could it work today?
Silent comedy is an unfortunate term in some respects. I prefer visual comedy in many ways. But I don't know. I mean, there are people, there's still silent visual comedy still exists in comedy today. Bits of, maybe The Office was full of looks to camera and stuff. So it hasn't died out. It's just it's been absorbed within the mainstream of what comedy is. But I much prefer the visual joke to the verbal joke. A verbal joke is difficult to remember after you've seen an act. You know, you may remember. You know, you may sort of think, I remember laughing a lot, but I can't exactly remember what they were saying. But if you see a verbal thing, like in One Foot in the Grave, when Victor Meldrew reaches down to pick up the phone and it's a small sausage dog. That image is just hilarious. So I love the well constructed, surprising visual gag. I think it has more of an impact on us than a written one.
You're right as well. The Office and Curb Your Enthusiasm have really worked on that because there's no canned laughter to kind of fill the gaps. They let you get the joke yourself.
Yes, which is also sort of what is refreshing about silent comedy is that when you're seeing a good film in with the right print and all that right sort of quality print at the right speed and all that sort of stuff, the laughter can just build and build and build because there's no dialogue to get in the way. So you can actually build up a tremendous atmosphere.
So what's your favourite form of comedy? Is this it then, the subtleties of silent comedy?
No, I have no favourite. There's all different kinds of comedy, Jewish humour, Irish humour, the stuff of Charlie Chaplin or Groucho Marx, or Monty Python or Tony Hancock, or it's just there's such a wide. I mean, I just like good stuff. I like stuff that entertains me.
It's interesting, like the Jewish humour, when you look at Mel Brooks and Jackie Mason, people like that. It's acerbic, and even Joan Rivers. It's almost as if people like Paul O'Grady have almost encapsulated that, although they're not even Jewish. Yes. It's that same kind of...
Well, yes, there is that sort of like, there's sort of that attack behind it, behind the delivery as well. Well, Paul's very funny, it's... he is spontaneously funny in an awe-inspiring way.